Hello everyone and welcome back. This week we're going to be looking at different types of bust support from the Regency era. Now, before you say anything, I know that the Regency era is technically, from a political standpoint, 1811 to 1820. However, when it comes to fashion history, very often the fashion styles that we can sort of group together don't line up perfectly with how we define the political eras. So whereas styles that developed in the early 1790s and were notably a distinct style from around 1795 to around 1820, there's not a political term that we can apply to that entire era. So for the purposes of my video and not having to define that consistently, I'm just going to say Regency era. I know it's not perfect, but we don't really have a better term to encompass that fashion era. So, bust support is dramatically different in this era than in previous ones. In the 18th century, stays are conical shaped. They are rigid, they are smooth, and they're not there to reduce the waist, but they are there to support the bust with a little bit of compression, as well as support the back and the weight of the heavy petticoats that are tied about the waist. So that's the reason for those little tabs down at the hips. They're there to help spread out and carry the weight. This shifts dramatically in the 1790s as the waistline starts to rise. Garments are lighter and looser and softer. They don't need the same rigid underbase in order to get a smooth line. Instead, they are moving towards a more natural bust and body shape. The classical era, the Greeks and the Romans, are heavily inspiring many different elements of fashion, not just in clothing, but in architecture and mindsets and politics. It's everywhere. So this softer, more natural, wrapped, gathered style is what is in. This means that they're taking those stays of the 18th century, reducing the amount of structure in them, raising the actual waistline so the tabs are no longer serving a purpose around the hips, and in some cases they start to cut out the bust and add in gathered cups. This helps support the bust, but gives it a more natural shape. So this shape is what continues and carries us into the beginning part of the 19th century. This is when we start seeing the term corset regularly used. You can start seeing it in the 1790s, but it is heavily solidified as of the beginning of the 19th century, and you will regularly find advertisements for stays and corset makers by the turn of the century. Now, I want to make a very specific note here. Corset, in their terminology, is not just an undergarment. So you will find plenty of fashion plates that mention a corset as an outer garment, as a bodice of sorts, whether it is just a laced bodice of, say, velvet or silk that goes over a gown, something that is decorative and fashionable and fancy and is visible, or it can be any number of undergarments that were meant to be more practical and functional. So there's a wide variety of what they call a corset in this era, and they use that term very liberally. Very liberally. It doesn't have to be a structured thing. It can be very unstructured or completely unstructured. It can be fairly heavily structured with a heavy wooden busk in front and bones in the back, other locations for that structure in terms of quilting or boning as well. So there are many, many different garments that fall under this range of bust support that they would term as corsets. In my case, I have quite a few examples that I have made over the years. Not all of them fit me, unfortunately. So I've made a couple of new pieces for this video so we can have a little bit more of a comparison of these different styles, but we will look at the pieces that I still own that no longer fit me as well. Though I can't necessarily provide a nice updated video on that, I will try and put some photographs in where I can. So what I personally have is a pair of 1790s stays that do still fit me, that have the cutout gathered cups and the very, very high waistline. I also have a bodiced petticoat, which sometimes also did use the terminology of corset. So that is a very simple, unstructured garment. I also have an 18 teens long corset that is corded, has a straight wooden busk in the front, and boning and lacing in the back. This no longer fits me, unfortunately. I did put it on for my 100 years of corset video back in November, but it fits me even less than it did then at this point in time, so I'm not going to try and squeeze myself into that because it's not a good example of the actual shape. But this is one particular style of corset that definitely was commonly found in the era. In fact, the synonymous nature of the busk and the corset comes up quite often. And I even found one description of what a corset was from the beginning of the century that says it is a wooden strip down the front that then has fabric wrapped around it and wraps around the body. So this person was defining the corset based off of the busk rather than just a bodice or some sort of other less structured garment that wraps around and supports the bust. So there are many ways to define this, but in general you seem to see long corset referenced fairly often, and that makes sense as a way to define that particular style. The difficulty that I have in giving a lot of evidence for what this exactly looked like throughout the different decades is in the fact that most of the surviving examples don't have dates on them, and they are not terribly different between, say, 1810 and 1820, or 1820 and 1830. There are some subtle differences, but it's really hard because things like the depth of your gores is not only adjusted by the fashionable placement of them, but is also differentiated in the size of the bust and the shape of the bust that goes into them. So it's really hard to say that particular one is from 1808 or that one is from 1822. It's just not that simple, but long corsets certainly were around at this point in time. I do happen to have a more 1820s, 1830s style as well, and so I'm going to be using that to show you the overall fit and shape that is ideal for these garments, though the bust for that will be slightly different than my 18-teens ideal style would be. There are also far less structured garments that were popular throughout the Regency era. One piece that I made a number of years ago and sadly no longer fits is that of what we would today consider sort of like a bra. It doesn't have length to it, it stops just under the bust, it does have built-in sleeves, and it has a surprisingly natural shape. It has no structure, it wraps around and ties in the front, and the actual shape of the cups for the bust are very natural. It's a little bit supportive. It's not dramatically supportive, it doesn't really hoist things up a lot, but it really speaks to those descriptions of particularly certain French women who seem to be wearing nothing at all underneath their gowns. It definitely gives that appearance. It really does. It does not have the soft rounded styles of the more English fashions. It's very natural. So if that's what you're going for, but you don't want to go with absolutely nothing, highly recommend that style. I wish I could give you pictures of that, but at the time that I made this thing, I did not feel like it was a decent thing to take pictures of because there's nothing hidden there at all. So I don't think I have any pictures surviving of it from when it did fit, and I can no longer get it over my shoulders. The other style that I found referenced over and over and over again went by a number of different names. So they very often would talk about either a patented corset or a Parisian corset or an Italian corset, or very, very often, and honestly I think the most common one, was a Circassian corset. Now, this was defined repeatedly as something that had no structure. It wrapped around and tied or hooked in the front. The straps did the same as well. It doesn't talk about the straps as often, but occasionally it does mention that they are meant to crisscross over the back and attach to the front of the garment. The purpose of this was to create a corset that provided support and a fashionable shape without any rigid structure, without any restrictions, and it was something that people could put on themselves, so it was meant to be very easy to wear, very easy to get on and off. It was ideal for people who were nursing or pregnant, or people who were stuck in bed for health reasons, or just generally wanted something much more comfortable and easy to wear. I found this to be fascinating because the next Regency thing I have on my list is likely going to be in a very hot and humid location, so I would really like this idea of a wrapped corset that is super lightweight, very easy to wear, flexible and movable, and I can adjust how tightly it's wrapped throughout the day if I need to. This sounds perfect to me. So I really wanted to make this particular garment. The difficulty is figuring out what exactly it looked like because there aren't any surviving examples that are defined images or originals as a Circassian corset. So I was fortunate enough that I came across a blog post from 2012 on the Corset Designs blog, and Amanda had put a lot of research that she had compiled and found into how they defined them and some originals that might be what we're talking about. So I found this to be a great place to start my journey. I went and looked at some of those originals, which now thankfully have more pictures. And the version that I really pinpointed and narrowed in on was this particular corset, which now has pictures of both the front and the back. It looks very comfortable and easy, aside from the fact that it has ties in the back, which I don't want to do, so I'm going to amend it slightly. There's also this image of a fashion plate where it's not called a Circassian corset, it's called a corset on X, but it definitely has the same feel, the same qualities to it. Now at this point you might be wondering why exactly they're calling this a Circassian corset. Did it come out of that region? Usually when we're talking about Italian or French, it's usually very often because it was supposedly invented in that region or popularized there. In the case of this particular style and this term, it's rather dark history. So this might be a little bit uncomfortable, but I think it's really important to understand where this sort of terminology comes from and the story behind it. In particular, the Circassian corset is named after a region in the Caucasus Mountains. It is up against the Black Sea, and it is no longer its own country. It was considered its own region at that particular time, however. And there's a whole lot of history with the Western Europeans and their relationship with that region and the idealization of the women and men from that region. And that is a whole complicated, really deep story. I've linked some things down below to help with that, but I'm not getting into that particular history today. Whew, that's a lot. Instead, what I want to talk about is why you will find Circassian brought up as a reference for a fashionable garment, not just on corsets, but on all sorts of other garments in the 18 teens, and why it really pops up in 1814. In the early 18th century, Russia decided, or more specifically Peter decided, that they were trying to take in other lands that were next to what was defined as Russia. This region was one of them. It was not successfully taken over by Peter, and Catherine continued the endeavor to take over this land, and that continued throughout the 18th century. And at the beginning part of the 19th century, they started sending in troops that burned down villages, and generally there was a lot of violence. This was something that Western Europe became aware of, and it was regularly in newspapers and magazines of the day. So while there were certainly political and government-based efforts being made, well, the fashionable women decided to raise awareness for this plight by naming lots of fashionable items after the region. This is not without any connection. There certainly were Circassian corsets that were part of the traditional dress that were unstructured leather or heavy textile types of corsets that fastened in front. So they were basing it off of a garment that did exist in many ways, but they were doing this as a way to raise awareness for the situation. The issues in that region continue to grow well throughout the 19th century, and when we reach the latter part of the 1850s, that was when Russia made a really big push to take over the region and successfully took the land, drove out millions of people from the region, and also had a mass genocide. And if you have never heard about this, it's not that shocking. We don't really teach it. We don't really talk about it, at least in American schools. And I don't think it's commonly discussed in other places either. In fact, if you have heard of it, but you may not necessarily recognize where, it's likely from 2010 when the Winter Olympics took place in that region. And the displaced generations that now live in Turkey and Jordan and other regions were trying to get different governments around the world to recognize the genocide that had occurred. So this is something that is still a politically divisive thing, and it's still being discussed today because recognizing that this occurred has become difficult. Many places and powers have very much determined that it was not that big of a deal and it didn't actually happen like that, and it's perfectly fine. So it's still a political issue today, even though it took place over 150 years ago. Obviously, that's a very heavy history and a very difficult one, but it's important to understand where these terminologies and fashions sometimes find their origins, because you will actually find Circassian, insert fashionable item here, throughout the 19th century. So now you know a little bit more about where that sort of terminology can come from. And there certainly are many terms that don't come from that sort of background, but there are some fashionable terms that utilize this system as well. This is not the only one. It's just one that is particularly relevant to our discussion today because, like I said, the Circassian corset was everywhere. The articles, especially around 1814 to 1819, talk about it being the most fashionable and popular style out there because women could wear this comfortably, they could get in and out of it easily, and it was just incredibly popular. Some articles claim that everyone was wearing them, that all of the fashionable women were wearing them. It was just everywhere. So it's interesting that so few examples of what might be originals for this survive, but there are at least a couple. And so I'm basing mine off of that one we have really great pictures of and a lot of information for. I'm just going to adjust it because I don't want to have to deal with tying things behind my back. I like the idea that is advertised as I can put this on myself. So that is what I'm going to do, sort of a combination of the fashion plate and of the original garment. The question that I, of course, have is how does this support the bust? What shape does it give you? Does it work as well or similarly to some of the more structured corsets and garments of the time, or some of the more unstructured ones? So I'm going to show you a comparison of the other support garments that I currently have. So that way we can see how it differs from some of those other options, because there shouldn't be only one choice out there or only a couple choices out there if you are doing this era in terms of bust support. There were lots of different bodies and lots of different needs and lots of different overgarments during this era, and so there have to be lots of different types of support garments in order to deal with that. And so I think it's very important for us to take a look at some of the options that they would have had that we don't usually see remade and worn today for costuming and reenactment purposes. Because I think there can be a lot more options and some better options out there for different people. So hopefully by the end of this, you'll have a better idea of maybe what sort of garment you want to try making to give you the support that you need, the comfort that you need, the movement that you need. Maybe it's something where you need to be able to get yourself into it easily, or maybe it's a specific shape that you're going for fashionable reasons, depending on the gown that goes over it. Either way, you have lots of choices, and we're going to talk about many of them today. For a reference's sake, I figured I could start with no support system. So this is what this particular gown that I'm going to try on over everything looks like with no structural support. There is a little flat piece of linen that pins across to the center front that is under these gathers. It's part of the gown. So that offers a little bit of support, but that's it. It just essentially means that I have a nice smooth front. Doesn't offer a lot of lift or anything like that. So this is the neutral position. The one thing to note that you cannot see is that this line here is actually slightly above my underbust. So because of the location of my bust currently, I can't quite pull this down far enough to get quite to my underbust. So that's a little weird feeling at the moment because this was made for some sort of lift. First example is that of my 1790 stays. As I mentioned earlier, they are essentially very shortened version of 18th century stays. My true waist is down here, so it's raised up a couple of inches, and the cups have been cut into the shape so that way it's less conical and more natural. I have found with this particular style that because it is so lightweight in the center front, there's not a hard busk. just a couple of lighter weight bones, that it doesn't do a lot to separate out like you would expect a little bit later in the era. This particular style still has a little bit of flat thrust to the front, even though there is some natural shape to the bust. There's still a fairly flat front, it's just curvy from here and out, rather than across the front being a curve from the top view position. Trying on the dress with my 1790s stays. This particular gown is from around 1800 and it was made to go over this particular pair of stays, so this is pretty much the ideal situation for this particular shape of gown. You will see that the underbust is much tighter to my body. It's actually where it should be. There is a very distinct curve to the bust, especially from the side, and everything is lifted into place. There's not a gradual sort of slope underneath where I'm trying to squeeze that gathering into. Everything is very clear cut out and up. Though this is not a very long pair of stays, it does help flatten out this front section in this area. And you definitely don't see the belly further down because there's enough gathering in front, but it might not do as well in the flat fronted styles later in the era. So this particular set of stays is best for the gathered fronts of the 1790s and early 1800s. Of course, this corset is far less ideal for the later 1815 gown, which does not need the bust sitting in this position. It actually wants it in a different position, different shape, and sitting a little bit differently at the underbust too. You'll actually find that my underbust is there, which is at the bottom of the waistband, so that's not ideal for the way this needs to fit at all. And you can see the little ridges left by the stays underneath. There's a weird pointiness to the darts in this that isn't there when I'm wearing it over the correct undergarment. So this is not at all the right shape or position for my bust for this gown. Bodiced petticoats don't have as distinct of a particular year because they can be bodiced in many different ways. I chose with this particular one to use darts because I find that that actually helps support my bust upwards a little bit better than the gathering does, where my bust will kind of fill into that space without actually getting support. Not that you need a lot of gathering in these, they can be fairly flat across the front, but this seemed to help lift me a little bit better and made it so that it was nice and tight to my underbust. So as you can see, my underbust sits where it should be. My bust is slightly lifted, not as much as it was, say, in the 1790s corset, but enough that it feels fairly comfortable. The bodiced petticoat actually does pretty well for my 1800 gown. It doesn't offer quite as much lift and support as my 1790s corset does, but it is more so than my natural state without anything. The bust position for the 1815 gown is certainly more correct than the 1790s corset. The underbust does actually sit pretty close to where my underbust wants to be, so it's not as full, it's not causing as many problems. The bust level is a little bit closer to where it ideally would be. Of course, I do have the issues with this particular gown since it is fairly off the shoulder comparative to most of my undergarments. You can currently see the straps. However, this particular under petticoat could be made with a different position for where the straps sit according to the back, which would adjust that particular problem. And here we have my new soft corset, which provides, as I found, pretty good support, especially since the straps are very adjustable, and that is where most of the support comes from, as well as the fact that this is very adjustable, so if I need more space and I need it to be more comfortable, I can easily change that lacing at any point in time. It's actually pretty accessible, even if I have to go up under a gown to do so. So I find that this one offers a lot of support, does not have constriction, and puts everything in a really good place. I'm curious to see what it looks like under the gowns. I do find that because there isn't a distinct point of pressure at the underbust mark, it's a little bit lower than that it doesn't pull in really tight to under the bust. If I wanted to do that more so, I might go with something closer to the original example that I looked at, which had a straight meet and back rather than a crisscrossed point, and would actually allow you to tighten in that under bust point right there. So depending on what your bust needs, if it has a tendency to try and slip down there, then maybe adding an extra tie at the back that someone else can do, or you can work your way through, might be a good idea. Or perhaps a drawstring or something that you can tie in front if you need to. With the 1800s gown, this has a slight bit more lift than the bodiced petticoat does, not quite as much as the 1790s corset, so it is somewhere in between those two, which means that it offers a nice shape, but without the structure of the 1790s stays, and a little bit more support than the bodiced petticoat, so it's a nice middle ground as far as I'm concerned, especially for around this era. While this particular corset is based off of something likely more in the 18 teens than around 1800, it would still be okay for that particular era from the looks of it. The only problem that I have found is because of the crisscross straps in the back, some of the lower back neck styles of certain gowns may be a little bit complicated to deal with. So either you have to choose your gown neck style accordingly in back, make sure that it's higher or more narrow, or you need to wear a kerchief or some sort of chemisette or some sort of tucker in order to cover that up. However, there are some mentions of the straps that go crisscrossed in the back, anchoring to the sides of the corset by way of hooks, which will allow you to lower that point rather than having to tie it in front and it's wanting to raise up. So the further down to the side the hook point would be, the lower the X is going to be in back. With the 1815 gown, the bust does seem to be in the correct position for this era, which makes sense because that's probably about when the corset is from. It does not have the separated out front that you would expect from, say, around 1808, but it does have the very flat darted style of front that you expect from the latter part of the 18 teens. So this works for that. I did try taking the straps over and under and around and tying it off and back. That has worked. When I put the gown on, I had to tighten them up a little bit, and I would tuck them underneath the arms of the gown. However, I can't quite reach that comfortably on myself. So if I had someone helping me, I could do that. I do want to specify I almost always wear a chemisette with this gown. I've never worn it without something filling in the neckline. So usually my straps aren't an issue, but it's nice to know if I had to, I could probably get these straps up and out of the way while still managing enough support because the gown is holding them in place over my shoulders tightly. I can get underneath of the gown and tighten up the straps as much as I need to. I just would not have put the extra shaping into my straps if I wanted to regularly do this. I would keep them very narrow the whole way, maybe about 1.5 inches instead of adding a little bit of width at that crossed point like the fashion plate had. This particular corset I actually made intending to use it for the 1830s, but considering where the bust seems to sit on me, I find it's probably more appropriate for the 1820s, possibly even as early as 1815. This is partly due to the depth of the particular bust gores. Mine do go a little bit lower than where my actual underbust sits, just about 1/2 inch. But because my bust has gotten a little bit larger since I made this particular corset, it now fills in that space a little bit differently, and it fits a little bit closer to an 18 teens or 18 early 20s corset than the 1830s or 40s styles that you can find. So that's one of the defining factors, along with the busk. I do have a wooden busk in, however this has a slight curve to it, which is more indicative of the 1830s and 40s. However, that's completely removable. So all I have to do is put in a straight busk instead, and that should alter the front line just slightly. Other than that, the overall shape is fine for either of those eras. So theoretically, this particular corset style should manage pretty well to also do a lot of stuff in the sort of 18 teens range. But overall, I definitely have the most lifted and supported bust in this particular corset of all of the different styles that I have. First off, we have the 1800 gown. It looks generally fine from the front. The straps can tuck out of the way pretty easily. The bust is fine in terms of the front view. However, if I turn to the side, There's a lot happening above the gown line, and it's frankly just too much. I don't know another way of putting that. This particular corset can lift a lot and does well for that, but you need the right gown neckline to go with that. There's a reason why the gown necklines raise up in a different way. It's not that they're super high up, it's not a modesty thing. It just looks better with the right gown neckline. This just detracts from the beauty of the bodice. It looks almost unbalanced and uncomfortable. It's not uncomfortable, it just looks really unbalanced. Like, I don't know a better way to put it. So I would not recommend this style of corset for the 1790s or very early 1800s. It just doesn't feel right. It really doesn't. Last example, 1815 gown with a corset that really fits with this time period in terms of overall shape. And you can tell the bust fills out the gown really well. It's not disproportional to everything else. It looks correct. It's held in the right height. It has the right shape. The fullness is at the right position. And if I had someone to assist me actually getting this gown closed and helping the straps off of my shoulders, I could theoretically hide the corset entirely underneath this gown. But it feels correctly positioned for the first time. I feel like I'm filling out this gown appropriately, and I feel like this is the correct shape. I don't feel like it is disproportionate like I did with the 1800 gown. I also do want to specify that because of the busk down the front, it really flatters the flat front style of gowns. It helps control the body because it is visible down the center front with this particular style of gown. So this is ideal for smoothing out the entire figure and making sure that you don't have any lumps or bumps or creases or awkward things occurring in the front of these flat style of gowns, which don't hide nearly as much as their gathered front siblings. Ma'am,